Richard stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and the other pointing straight at my bedroom. "Start packing," he said. "Jason and his family are taking this room." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. "My room?" I asked. He nodded without the slightest hesitation. "They have 2 children. They need the space more than you do." Downstairs, I could hear furniture scraping across the hardwood floor. Jason and his wife, Melissa, had already started carrying boxes inside as though the decision had been made hours ago. I stepped into the hallway. "Dad, I paid $65,000 toward this house." Jason laughed from the bottom of the stairs. "That was years ago, Ella. You don't keep bringing that up every time someone needs your help." Melissa unfolded a tape measure and walked straight into my bedroom. "I just want to see if our king bed fits," she said casually. She didn't even ask permission. I looked back at my father. "You told me this would always be my home." His expression never changed. "And I'm telling you now that family comes first. Stop being selfish." For 31 years, I had given in every single time. This time, I didn't move. "No." The word hung in the hallway. Richard's eyes hardened. "If you won't give your brother the room." He pointed directly at the front door. "Then pack your things and leave." None of them realized I was about to do exactly that. Nobody spoke. Jason folded his arms with the confident smile of someone who had already won. Melissa continued measuring walls as if I had already disappeared. Even my 2 young nieces peeked around the staircase, confused by the silence filling the house. I searched my father's face for even a hint that this was a negotiation. There wasn't one. "You'd really throw me out?" I asked quietly. "You've made your choice," Richard replied. "Either your brother gets the room or you don't live here anymore." I let the words settle. This was the same house where I'd spent weekends replacing broken flooring after my mother passed away. The same house where I'd written check after check whenever the roof leaked or the plumbing failed. Every repair, every improvement, every sacrifice had been made because my father promised we were building a future together. Now none of that seemed to matter. Jason shrugged. "You'll find another apartment. We need the room now." Without answering, I walked back into the bedroom. Instead of throwing clothes into suitcases in frustration, I packed calmly. A week's worth of clothes. My laptop. My passport. Family photographs of my mother. Nothing else. As I carried my final bag into the hallway, I stopped beside the old filing cabinet that had stood there for years. Richard was busy explaining paint colors to Jason. Melissa was discussing where to place the children's bunk beds. No one looked my way. I quietly opened the bottom drawer. Inside sat a thick manila envelope. I slid it into my tote bag, closed the drawer without a sound, and headed toward the front door. Richard didn't even watch me leave. He simply smiled at Jason. "Tomorrow we'll repaint the room." I rested my hand on the doorknob and looked back one last time. "Dad." He finally turned. "I hope you remember everything you signed." The smile slowly disappeared from his face. I walked out before he could answer. The first thing my friend Natalie did was hand me a mug of coffee. The second was ask the question everyone else probably would have. "What happened?" Ella managed a tired smile as she set her overnight bag beside the guest room door. "My dad chose my brother." Natalie frowned. "I don't think that's the whole story." Ella looked around the small apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. For the first time all day, no one was demanding anything from her. She sat down. "It started years ago." Natalie listened without interrupting. After Ella's mother died, the house had slowly begun falling apart. The roof leaked during every heavy rain. The furnace failed one winter. The kitchen plumbing burst just weeks after that. Richard had complained constantly about money. "I don't know how I'm supposed to keep this place," he'd said one evening. Jason had offered sympathy. "I'd help, Dad, but the kids are expensive." It became a familiar sentence. Every repair somehow became Ella's responsibility. She postponed vacations, turned down a promotion that would have required moving to another city, worked overtime whenever another unexpected expense appeared. Whenever she hesitated, Richard always gave the same reassurance. "Don't think of it as spending money," he'd tell her. "You're investing in your own future. One day this house will belong equally to you and Jason." She believed him. Every single time. The biggest contribution came 3 years earlier. Richard had called her into the dining room and spread renovation estimates across the table. "The bank won't approve another loan," he'd admitted. Ella studied the paperwork. "How much do you need?" Richard hesitated before answering. 65,000. It was nearly everything she'd managed to save over years of careful budgeting. "I'll have almost nothing left." "You won't lose it," Richard promised. "This protects all of us." Jason had been sitting nearby. Instead of offering part of the money, he'd simply nodded. "You're in a better position than I am, Ella. Besides, you're single." She remembered forcing herself to smile. "Okay." Within a week, the money had been transferred. The renovations went ahead. Life returned to normal. Or so she'd believed. Back in Natalie's apartment, the room fell quiet. Natalie finally asked, "If all of that is true, why didn't you fight your father before leaving?" Ella looked toward the tote bag, resting beside the bed. "I didn't need to." Natalie's eyes followed hers. "The folder." Ella nodded once. "It's the only thing I couldn't leave behind." "What is it?" Ella smiled faintly. "You'll understand soon enough." She refused to say another word. Across town, Richard was in a completely different mood. He raised a glass of iced tea toward Jason and Melissa. "Now the house finally makes sense." Melissa laughed as she stood in the middle of the primary bedroom. "I've already picked out new curtains." Jason pulled renovation photos up on his tablet. "We'll knock out this closet and expand the bathroom." Richard nodded approvingly. "Go ahead, it's your room now." None of them noticed that the only thing Ella had chosen to take wasn't jewelry. It wasn't cash. It wasn't even sentimental keepsakes. It was one old folder that Richard had completely forgotten existed. Why was that folder the only thing Ella made sure to save? 3 days later, Richard stood in the backyard flipping burgers, while relatives filled the patio with laughter. "Looks like the house is finally full again," his sister Linda said with a smile. Richard puffed out his chest. It was time. Jason's family needed the room and Ella. Well, she decided to leave. He deliberately chose those last words. She decided. The story spread quickly around the gathering. Several relatives nodded sympathetically toward Richard. "I can't believe she'd walk away over a bedroom," one cousin muttered. Another shook his head. "She's always been too stubborn." Richard accepted every word without correcting anyone. He didn't mention the investment. He didn't mention the ultimatum. And he certainly didn't mention pointing at the front door. Across the yard, Jason overheard the comments and smiled. "She'll calm down eventually," he said. "She always does." Melissa squeezed his arm. "By then, this place will already feel like home." Inside the house, Melissa proudly showed family members around the primary bedroom. "We're repainting next weekend," she said. "The kids will finally have enough space." An aunt admired the room. "You've done so much already." Melissa laughed. "Not yet. We're replacing the flooring too." Just then, the doorbell rang. Richard wiped his hands on a towel. "I'll get it." Standing outside was a courier holding a certified envelope. "Richard Lawson." "That's me." "I need your signature." Richard signed absent-mindedly and closed the door. He glanced at the return address. His relaxed expression disappeared. "What is it?" Jason asked. "Nothing." Richard tried to slide the envelope under a stack of mail. But Linda had already noticed the official seal. "Legal documents." Richard forced a laugh. "Probably some tax paperwork." He tore open the envelope. The first page made his hands freeze. Jason stepped closer. "Dad." Richard quickly turned the page over. "It's nothing important." "What does it say?" "I said it's handled." His voice came out sharper than he intended. Several conversations around the room faded as relatives sensed something was wrong. Linda looked at the top sheet before Richard could pull it away. "I just saw Ella's name." The room became noticeably quieter. Another uncle frowned. Why would legal papers about the house mention Ella? Richard swallowed. "They're mistaken." "But you said she didn't own anything," Linda replied. Jason looked back and forth between them. "Dad, why would her name be on property documents?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stuffed every page back into the envelope. "The celebration's over." Melissa blinked. "What?" "You all need to leave." "Dad." "I said everyone out." The cheerful afternoon dissolved into awkward silence as relatives gathered their belongings. People exchanged confused glances while quietly whispering among themselves. Something clearly wasn't adding up. The last car pulled away. Jason closed the front door. He turned toward his father. "Enough." Richard avoided eye contact. "What are you talking about?" "The papers." "They're irrelevant." Jason folded his arms. "Were you lying to us?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I'll take care of it." Without another word, he hurried down the hallway and disappeared into his home office. A second later, drawers slammed open. Cabinets banged. File boxes hit the floor. Jason stared toward the closed office door as papers rustled frantically inside. For the first time in years, his father looked scared. The office looked as though a storm had torn through it. Folders lay scattered across the floor. File boxes had been emptied onto the desk. Richard dropped to one knee and yanked open the bottom drawer of an old cabinet for the third time. "No." He pulled every file out, flipping through them with increasing panic. "No, no, no." Jason stepped into the doorway. "What are you looking for?" Richard didn't answer. Instead, he rushed to another cabinet and searched through years of paperwork, muttering under his breath. "It has to be here." Jason watched silently until Richard slammed another drawer shut. "Dad." Still no response. "Dad." Richard finally looked up. "The original agreement." Jason frowned. "What agreement?" Richard hesitated for just a second too long. "The investment paperwork." Jason stared at him. "You told me she just helped with repairs." Richard rubbed a hand across his forehead. "It was more complicated than that." Before Jason could ask another question, Richard grabbed his phone. "I'm calling my attorney." The attorney agreed to meet the next morning. Richard arrived carrying a folder filled with photocopies, but he couldn't hide his uneasiness. After listening to the situation, the attorney leaned back in his chair. "Let me make sure I understand." Richard nodded. "My daughter contributed $65,000 toward the property years ago. And I asked her to leave." The attorney looked over his glasses. "Did she leave voluntarily?" Richard shifted in his seat. "I told her she could give up her bedroom or move out." The attorney's expression changed immediately. "So you excluded her from the residence?" Richard tried to interrupt. "It wasn't like that. But that's exactly how it could be interpreted." The room fell silent. The attorney opened one of the photocopied documents. "Do you have the signed original?" Richard swallowed. "I can't find it." The attorney slowly closed the file. If your daughter has the original, that's a serious problem. He turned another page. This agreement doesn't simply acknowledge her contribution. Richard's stomach tightened. It establishes protected financial rights. He pointed to a specific clause. If she's permanently denied occupancy under the terms described here, repayment becomes immediately due. Richard blinked. Immediately? Yes. That's impossible. The attorney remained calm. Then you'll need to refinance the property. Richard looked away. The bank already rejected one refinance years ago. Then selling may become your only realistic option. The words landed like a hammer. Everything Richard believed he controlled suddenly felt fragile. Jason was waiting outside the office. The moment his father walked out, he stood. Well, Richard remained quiet. Jason stepped closer. Tell me the truth. Richard finally spoke. She has rights. Jason frowned. What kind of rights? The investment wasn't just an investment. Jason's face hardened. You told me she gave you money because she wanted to. I didn't think this would happen. You didn't think throwing your own daughter out would have consequences. Richard looked down. Jason took a slow breath. You let me believe she'd contributed almost nothing. Richard didn't respond. You let me move my family into that room. Still nothing. Jason shook his head in disbelief. I've been defending you. That evening, Melissa stood in the primary bedroom with a paint catalog in one hand. Jason walked in. Stop. She looked up. What? Don't order anything. She laughed. I'm just picking colors. We're not renovating. Her smile faded. What do you mean? Jason sat on the edge of the bed. The room might not even stay hours. Melissa stared at him. What happened? Dad lied. Those two words were enough. She slowly lowered the catalog onto the dresser. So, we could lose everything we planned. Jason nodded once. I think Dad knew that all along. Meanwhile, the story was spreading through the family. Linda called Ella. I owe you an apology. Ella remained polite. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Richard made it sound like you left over a bedroom. It was never about the bedroom. I know that now. By the end of the day, 2 more relatives reached out. Each conversation ended the same way. They had judged her without knowing the truth. Richard called Ella 3 times. She declined each call. Finally, he left a voicemail. Ella, we don't need lawyers. A few minutes later, she returned the call. I'm willing to meet. Richard let out a relieved breath. I knew we'd work this out. But not privately. His smile disappeared. What do you mean? There will be attorneys. She paused. And a neutral mediator. Before Richard could argue, she ended the call. 2 days later, Richard entered the mediation office carrying the same worn briefcase he had taken to countless business meetings over the years. He expected to regain control the way he always had. Instead, his attorney quietly intercepted him before he reached the conference room. The attorney held a newly delivered document in his hand. His face was unusually serious. He lowered his voice. Richard. Richard looked at him anxiously. What now? The attorney handed him the document, but didn't let go immediately. Before you speak. He met Richard's eyes. There's something you need to see. Richard looked down at the document his attorney had handed him. Attached to the front was a copy of the original co-investment agreement. Every page had been professionally scanned. Every signature was perfectly clear. And clipped behind it were copies of bank transfers, renovation invoices, contractor receipts, and canceled checks spanning several years. His attorney spoke quietly. Her legal team sent these over this morning. Richard's face drained of color. They have everything. They have more documentation than we do. The conference room door opened. Ella is ready, the mediator said. Richard took a slow breath and walked inside. Ella was already seated with her attorney. She didn't glare at her father. She didn't smile. She simply waited. The mediator looked around the room. Thank you for attending. Our goal today is to resolve this dispute based on the facts. Ella's attorney slid a binder across the table. We'll begin with the financial record. One by one, the documents were placed in front of the mediator. The original wire transfer, showing Ella's $65,000 payment. Receipts for roofing work. Invoices for plumbing repairs. Payments for electrical upgrades. Statements showing years of mortgage contributions. Then came the final document. The signed agreement. The mediator adjusted his glasses and read silently for several moments. Finally, he looked up. This agreement is very clear. Richard shifted uncomfortably. The mediator continued. It expressly states that Miss Lawson's contribution was a protected financial investment, not a gift. Richard lowered his eyes. It also states she was guaranteed continued residency unless she voluntarily chose to leave. No one spoke. The mediator turned another page. And if she were permanently excluded from the property. He tapped the paragraph with his pen. The investment becomes immediately repayable, together with the agreed interest. Richard closed his eyes. He remembered signing those papers years earlier. At the time, he had never imagined they would matter. Now they mattered more than anything. I never thought she'd actually leave, Richard said quietly. Ella finally spoke. I didn't leave. Everyone turned toward her. You told me to choose between surrendering my home or walking out the front door. She held his gaze. You made that decision. I respected it. There was no anger in her voice. Only certainty. The mediator nodded. Based on the documentation before me, Miss Lawson's position is well supported. Richard looked at his attorney. What happens now? There are two practical options. His attorney spoke carefully. You refinance the property and repay her investment with accrued interest. He paused. Or the property is sold, so the obligation can be satisfied. Richard stared silently at the table. For the first time in years, there was no argument left to make. Outside the conference room, Jason stood waiting. When the meeting ended, Ella walked into the hallway. Jason slowly approached. I need to say something. She nodded. He took a deep breath. I believed Dad. I know. I thought you'd thrown away the family over a bedroom. Ella looked at him quietly. It was never about the bedroom. Jason shook his head. I understand that now. His voice cracked slightly. I should have asked questions instead of making assumptions. Ella didn't interrupt. I watched you pay for repairs. I watched you work weekends. I watched you give up things for this house. He looked away. And somehow, I convinced myself none of it mattered. Ella placed a hand gently on his arm. We can't change what happened. Jason nodded. But I'm sorry. For the first time since she had walked out of the house, Ella believed he meant it. Melissa joined them a few moments later. I owe you an apology too. Ella looked surprised. Melissa sighed. I was already planning renovations. I acted like that room belonged to us before anyone had even spoken to you. Ella gave a small smile. I appreciate you saying that. Melissa glanced toward Richard, who remained seated inside the conference room. I didn't realize how much had been hidden from all of us. Within 6 weeks, Richard completed a refinance. It wasn't easy. The monthly payments were significantly higher. But the loan allowed him to repay Ella's $65,000 investment, along with the interest required under the agreement. The money arrived in Ella's account with a short note. I should have kept my promise. There was no request for forgiveness, only an acknowledgement that he had broken his word. Word of the mediation quietly spread through the extended family. The same relatives who had once criticized Ella now understood the truth. They learned she hadn't been fighting over a bedroom. She had been standing up for years of sacrifice, promises, and financial commitments that everyone else had ignored. Richard's reputation changed almost overnight. People no longer accepted his version of events without asking questions. His favoritism toward Jason, once dismissed as harmless, was finally seen for what it had always been. Several months later, Ella stood in the doorway of a home that belonged entirely to her. Not because someone had promised it, because she had earned it. The walls were freshly painted. The living room was filled with sunlight. Every room reflected choices she had made for herself. Natalie carried in the last moving box. I still can't believe this is yours. Ella smiled. I can. Friends and a few supportive relatives gathered for a simple housewarming dinner. There were no arguments, no demands. No one expected her to give up her space for someone else. Late that evening, her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. If you ever want to come home, your room is waiting. Ella read it once. Then she typed a calm reply. I've already found my home. She set the phone down and walked back inside. The front door closed softly behind her. This time, no one could ever order her to leave.